Associate, Corpus Christi. This is Lynette Jackson. I am a quilter and educator here in Georgia, Marietta, Georgia to be specific, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about quilting and what I do. A quilt is a fabric sandwich, which means there are 3 layers to a quilt, and I'm going to show you what the 3 layers are. So if I go off camera and come back really quickly, it's because I'm going to grab some things to help you understand exactly what a quilt is. A lot of times when you see a quilt, the things that you see, this behind me is a quilt, this beside me is a quilt. People often think that what they see is the quilt. It's not. What you see, this top part, is what we call a top sheet. And the top sheet is your design, what you've decided to put your fabric together and make. And I have a few top sheets over here just to show. And I think they've become buried under my quilt. This one. This is a top sheet. It's thin, and all I've done is taken my fabric and sewed it together to make a top sheet. Well, once you've gotten your top sheet together, it's not very nice to sleep under because it's so thin. It'll still be cold. So, what we need to do is we take a middle layer and we take a bottom layer, and the bottom layer is called our backing. I'm going to go off and get my backing and come right back. Here's my backing. Backing is really just one big piece of fabric. And I will spread this out on the floor and make sure it lays really flat. And then I will put a middle layer. And my middle layer is called batting. I'm going to show you what batting is. Years ago, before machinery and the Industrial Revolution, people used to pick cotton and use the cotton that they picked for batting, and they would comb it out. Now we have machines that will comb out the cotton and make the batting for us. This is called batting. This is actually bamboo and cotton. It's really soft, and if I were to open it out, you could see that it looks like another big piece of fabric. But it's actually cotton that has been pressed together. And if I were to pull it apart, you would see it puffed out. And I would open this all the way out and spread it on top of my backing. Then I would take my top sheet and lay it on top of the 3 layers to make my sandwich. 1, 2, 3. But I'm not ready to quilt yet. I would need to put those 3 layers together, and if I were to sew them loosely, it's called basting. But I like to safety pin my 3 layers together, and I have an example of that. And I'll show you a quilt that has been put together, the 3 layers, and not quilted totally yet, but I'm working on it. That will be this one. This one, as you can see, has all 3 layers. You can see my back is a lovely shade of purpley magenta. I call it magenta. My batting, you can see, is sticking out. And my top sheet, and I safety pin them together. And then what I do is I sew all 3 layers using what is called a hoop, a quilter's hoop. And it's 2 circles. 1 circle on the top, and 1 circle on the bottom, which is in there somewhere. This is a really big quilt too. And after I put the circle on the bottom under there, I put the circle on the top, and I tighten it so that I can sew more easily. And I use a thimble, which is very important, and I use a sewing needle. And I sew through all 3 layers, and I put 1 hand under my quilt and 1 hand on top and sew through all 3 layers. Now, you might think to yourself, this is a lot of work for one person. And it is. a lot of work for one person. So, historically, which means a long time ago leading up to today, people used to get together and hold what they call quilting bees, where they would put a frame up. And a frame is like a square where I could spread out my entire quilt on something. Wood, now we have plastic frames. There are big wooden frames. And I might call my friends over. I might say, Melissa, Charlie, would you like to come over and help me sew? I've got some tops that need working on, and I pin them all together. And if you come help me sew mine, next week I'll come help you sew yours. And we may get together, and Melissa may bring some macaroni and cheese, and Charlie may bring his famous chicken, and we'd all get together and we'd sew, and then we'd have a party. And that was great fun for the whole community. And that's one of the ways that people would get together and share the things they had. And you might come over and see my quilt pattern and say, oh, that's beautiful. I'd like to make one like that. And I might share some fabric with you. So quilting was a way for people to get together as a community. And usually women were the ones who got together and did what was called the quilting bee, where everybody came together and sewed. But the men would come too after, for the food and the party. So, let me show you. Most people are interested in the top sheet and making all the pretty designs and the pretty patterns, and they have names. This one is called Sunflower. This one's a more difficult one. There are two different types of quilt tops. One type is called patchwork, and one type is called applique. A patchwork pattern is when I take fabric and I cut it into squares or triangles and I just sew them together. Applique is when I lay one piece of fabric on top of another piece of fabric and I sew it down. This quilt behind me is an example of applique. I've taken the black fabric, laid it on top of the red fabric, and sewed it down. The black and red on the side is called patchwork. I'm going to show you some examples of patchwork patterns. This is a mix. This is patchwork and applique, my sunflower, because I put these petals together by sewing the pieces together, but then I sewed the entire circle down. So that's what will be called the applique part of it. Let me show you some of my patchwork patterns. This is a patchwork, and patchwork patterns need to have names, so that if I talk about a pattern, people will know what I'm talking about. This one is called the geometric square. Geometry involves lots of different shapes. Do you see the different shapes on this quilt? Squares and triangles. Yes, squares and triangles. That's what Lynette works with. Squares and triangles. And depending on how big your square is or how big your triangle is, you can use and make different patterns. This one's geometric square. This one is called bear's paw. Does that look like a bear's paw to you? Or 4 bear's paws. I made this just using squares and triangles again. Squares and triangles. And then I sewed through all 3 layers and created another pattern. This is what we call a 9-patch. A very basic quilt pattern. What I like about quilting is there are no mistakes in quilting. What you see is what you get. This has a red backing. I hand-dyed this backing. And when I washed my quilt, the dye ran through and turned my entire quilt pink. So now I have a lovely pinkish quilt. There are no mistakes. I love this one just like every other quilt. Now,